Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Business Breeders, a live webinar series hosted by Goodman Group at Brock University. My name is Abdul Rahimi, and I'm the director of Goodman Group in the Goodman School of Business. Goodman Group is pleased to be hosting this webinar series, and thank you all for joining us today. Goodman Group is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support entrepreneurs, professionals, and businesses through our consulting services, startup support, and accredited certificate programs for professionals and executive development. I'm so pleased that so many of you could join us today from all over the world. We've had such a great interest from all corners of the world, especially to take a break with us and to take part in this wonderful webinar series. This webinar series was designed to focus on areas of leadership, management, innovation, financial, and social impacts of trending topics, where award-winning faculty from Brock University and leading industry experts will be speaking about such topics. This webinar series is hosted on Wednesdays from 11 to 11:45, so you can anticipate to see us for a few more weeks. Before I introduce today's webinar leader, let's just quickly review today's agenda. The webinar leader will speak for about 30 minutes, which is then followed by a Q&A session. So I invite all of you to, especially those who are watching us live, obviously, to type in your questions in the chat feature, which will be turned on momentarily. Now, I'm so pleased to introduce today's webinar leader, Dr. Paul Dunn, who is an award-winning professor of ethics at Goodman School of Business. Dr. Dunn has a bachelor's and a master's degree in philosophy and has a doctorate in accounting. Quite a mix, Paul. He has also significant industry experience and expertise, having had various senior roles with Ernst & Young and CIBC. He has been teaching at the Goodman School of Business, Brock University, since 1998. Although he started in his teaching career from in the accounting department, his passion quickly took him into the area of ethics, which he enjoys teaching at both undergraduate and graduate levels. Paul's research combines his academic schooling and philosophy and his practical experience in accounting, and he focuses primarily on business ethics and corporate governance. So his research has been published in top-tier academic journals, and he is an accomplished writer as well. He is the co-author of an ethics textbook entitled Businesses and Professional Ethics for Directors, Executives, and Accountants. Its 9th edition was just issued in March. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in inviting Dr. Paul Dunn. Paul, over to you.
When the vaudeville comedian W.C. Fields was near the end of his life, a friend visited him and was shocked to find Fields reading the Bible. Fields was not a religious man at all. "What are you doing?" friend asked. And Fields put down the Bible and he said, "Looking for the loopholes." My name is Paul Dunn, and I'm a business ethics professor at the Goodman School of Business. Welcome. This webinar is on the ethics of exploiting loopholes. So, just kind of by way of background information, as we all know, the economy basically came to a halt as a result of the pandemic. Various provinces, such as Ontario and British Columbia, now starting to slowly allow businesses to open. Meanwhile, throughout this crisis, the federal government has responded with almost daily announcements of financial aid, support to agriculture, tourism, fisheries, energy, transportation, money to students, the unemployed, small businesses, large corporations, billions of dollars, all for the public good. Now, the interesting thing is that normally legislation takes months of careful thought, debate, discussion, review, and assessment. Today, government just doesn't have the luxury of time. The need for financial assistance is immediate. Unfortunately, Laws and regulations written quickly often lack precision, even though we know that the purpose of this legislation is to help those who've been disadvantaged as a result of COVID-19. So now, let's talk about the law for a sec. I mean, to state sort of the obvious, we all have a social and legal obligation to obey the law. If you don't like a law, then you should lobby to have it changed. But we don't have the right to disobey the law. The law represents the minimum standard of socially acceptable behavior. But now there are two different attitudes towards this. Now, some say your obligation is to obey the laws as written. In other words, to adhere to the letter of the law. Others are going to say, no, you should probably follow the spirit of the law, sort of that good faith interpretation of the law. So two different attitudes, and so let's just kind of review both. The first we refer to as a compliance attitude. It elevates legal form over legal substance. And so you view the law quite literally. If the law prohibits something, you don't do it. If the law sanctions something, then you can do it. Now, there are loads of merits to this compliance approach to social responsibility. I mean, first, it's simple. I mean, it's easy. You just go and look up the law, see if the action is mentioned or not. Also tends to generate consistent behavior. People do what's, or don't do what's prohibited and do what is approved. And a compliance approach also is a very good defense in the event that your action is challenged. I mean, if you're queried, you simply say, well, look up the law. See, it specifically says I can do this. Or you say, I'm not doing this action because it's against the law. So yeah, let's just take kind of a simple example. Let's go to the beach here. So for everyone's enjoyment, the following are prohibited on the beach. No dogs, no ball games, no frisbees, no kites, no glass, no loitering. Also, no smoking, which appears it was probably added later on. So now, I mean, these rules seem reasonably clear. If you want to know if you can play soccer on the beach, well, you just look up the rule. It says no ball games, so you can't play soccer on the beach. There should also be consistent behavior on the beach. Frisbees are not going to be thrown around on the beach because it says no frisbees. And you can certainly justify drinking water from a plastic water bottle because it specifically says no glass, which means no glass water bottles on the beach. Reasonably clear. So this raises the question, well then, what's a loophole? Loopholes are sort of unintentional errors, omissions, ambiguities in the law. The key word here is unintentional. They're oopses, they're mistakes. And they're unintentional, wasn't meant to be there. And so this means that the letter of the law may be inconsistent with the spirit of the law. Now, the current COVID-19 legislation is being rushed into place. And unfortunately, there'll be a lack of precision in these rules, which means there will be loopholes. And these loopholes may have a personal or economic benefit. If you're a student, you might be able to find a loophole on the government website and be able to manage to obtain some money. If you're a business, you go onto the website looking for, again, that unintentional ambiguity. Now, if you find it, is exploiting the loophole a smart and effective business tactic, or are you gaming the system? So let's go back to the beach for a minute. Law clearly says no ball playing. That means no tennis because you play tennis with a tennis ball, and no volleyball because you play volleyball with volleyball. But what about badminton? You don't play badminton with a ball, you play it with a shuttlecock. So it appears as though we can play badminton on the beach. Now you may say, just a minute, this kind of violates the spirit of the law. The prohibition is about playing sports on the beach. But your rebuttal might be, well, it doesn't say that. The law doesn't say that. It specifically mentions ball playing, not the playing of sports. And so this illustrates sort of the problem with a literal interpretation of the law. Codes can't cover every contingency. And so some may take silence for assent. If it doesn't say I can't do it, that means I can do it. It specifically prohibits balls and frisbees on the beach, but it doesn't mention shuttlecocks. So guess I get to play badminton on the beach. But the reality is that an omission doesn't mean it's acceptable. It simply means that that specific activity may not have been thought of when the law was written. So how can you defend living to the letter of the law while simultaneously violating its spirit? Moral disengagement is the process of justifying the legitimacy of decision or an action that you know is questionable or unethical. So how do you do it? Well, one strategy is to shift the onus from yourself onto another person or group. So for example, blame the person who wrote the law for including the linguistic ambiguity. So you say, it's your fault that I'm playing badminton on the beach. You should have written a clearer, more precise rule. And so you try and claim the moral high ground here by blaming the other person for writing a law that had the unintentional loophole. Now this is a bit like blaming the wealthy man for having money. I mean, I wouldn't have robbed him if he hadn't have been rich, right? Or you say, well, everybody's doing it. And so now you shift personal responsibility from your own actions onto the mob, who basically made the decision for you. And so now there's no introspection about the legitimacy of your decision. You've just shifted this to other people. Another way is some people will use language strategically, basically to deny the ethical aspects of their decisions. So you deny the negative consequences. White-collar criminals will often say they weren't hurting anyone. It was a white-collar crime. It was a victimless crime. So I defrauded this company, but the company got all the money back through the insurance company. So really, this was a victimless crime. No one was hurt. The reality is that all of society pays for that crime because the insurance companies increased the premiums that we all pay to make up for the money that it had to pay out as a result of the fraud. Or people will try and dehumanize the activity. So, for example, extreme case, when firing people, insensitive human resource personnel might say, it's nothing personal, it's just business. The reality is all business is highly personal. All of our business decisions affect people, people who have names, faces, and families. Business is extremely social. Now, this issue of loopholes becomes a particular dilemma for financial advisors, such as tax accountants, tax lawyers, financial planners. And it was interesting, this morning, just before this presentation, I was listening to the news, and Finance Minister Bill Morneau provided details on the aid program for large corporations. Now, I'm sure that financial advisors are currently pouring through those details, looking for those unintended linguistic ambiguities. Now, in the spirit of pulling together, Will they report those loopholes to the finance minister to maintain fairness for all Canadians? Unlikely. This is not what they get paid to do. Their job is to detect weaknesses in laws that profit corporations. Let me give you a few examples here. The Panama Papers that were released in 2016 and then the Paradise Papers in 2017 revealed the widespread use of tax havens by the uber rich. When financial advisors were criticized for helping the 1% to pay almost no tax, they defended themselves with a compliance response. We didn't break any laws. Like, duh, of course they didn't break any laws. It's not the job of financial advisors to break the law. But to expect praise for not breaking the law is analogous to expecting to be commended for not robbing a bank. Another example, tax advisors design highly complicated tax schemes that are utilized by multinationals. Google, for example, transferred 19.9 billion euro through a Dutch company to an Irish company located in Bermuda where there are no corporate taxes. Okay, that's complicated. Not our fault, the tax advisors said. Wouldn't have designed this complex tax dodge if the laws of all these governments had meshed. So they morally disengage by blaming the government and thereby relieving themselves of considering the ethical implications of their actions. Now, as was mentioned in the intro, I'm a CPA, and the rules of professional conduct require that I put the public interest ahead of the personal interests of my clients. Now, this means moving from mere observance to the letter of the law to instead complying with the spirit of the law. But because the accounting profession is a self-governing body, we must demonstrate self-restraint. So, talking about sort of self-restraint, I like to think about curling every once in a while. I like curling. What's really cool about curling is there are no referees and there are no umpires in curling. It's a self-regulating sport. People freely admit if they accidentally touched a stone with their broom, it's called burning a stone. Curlers know the rules and they take personal ownership by admitting their mistakes. I think we can learn a lot about personal integrity from curling. I mean, loopholes illustrate the tension between public welfare and personal gain. This becomes particularly acute during a pandemic. So the question that applies to all Canadians, regardless of whether you're in the business of providing financial advice or not, is, are you willing to police yourself? I mean, now's the time for ethical leadership by not only business leaders, but business advisors and citizens alike. Now's the time when we need to put ethics ahead of personal economic self-interest. In the spirit of the current financial aid packages, which are to provide support to the disadvantaged, I think it's more important that we all adhere to the spirit of the law. We need to all protect the public interest by refraining from exploiting loopholes. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul, for your insights on this engaging topic. Ethics is a topic that touches everyone, indeed, and at all times. One of the ones that I, quotes that has stood with me for time is, how would this look on the front page of the Daily News when coming to taking an action, whether it's the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? Asking oneself that question in my scenario, that has served me pretty well. So thank you for those insights in there. I'd now like to invite you to answer the questions that have come through the live chat while you were presenting on this topic, and also those that we received during registration when folks were registering. So I'm just going to switch and read the first question. In light of the potential for individuals to try to game the system and clawbacks when audits by CRA or other government organizations, what positive and negative implications could this have on the financial services sector and Canadian society?
Whoa, that was rather complex. Do you mind reading that again about the clawbacks?
Absolutely. In light of the potential for individuals to try to game the system and clawbacks when audits by CRA or other government organizations, what positive and negative implications could this have on the financial services sector and Canadian society?
I'm not too sure I quite understand the question still. The clawbacks occur when people claim. So, for example, if you're elderly, if you're over 65, you can claim the old age security. But if you make, if you're still employed and still making lots of money, then you pay that money back to the government. The expression is referred to as clawback, but really what it means is you received more money than you should have because you were gainfully employed and making, let's say, $200,000 a year salary, and therefore you just repay that money back to the government. I'm not too sure I answered that question, so let's quickly move to the next one that I might be able to answer.
No, I think you touched on that one. So the next one is, what trends are you seeing with legislations? Are they getting longer, perhaps more complex? The more recent legislation pieces coming out of the Parliament and other places compared to those in the older days? And could this be explained by an effort to counter loopholes? Or are there any other possible explanations? What are your thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, my concern is that the legislation is being put in so quickly that that all of the careful thought that normally goes into legislation, the long debates, the discussions, the white papers, the arguments in Parliament, when it goes into committee, when committees have experts come and make comments on the legislation. Unfortunately, we don't have enough, the government doesn't have enough time to do that today because the need is just so immediate for everyone. And so my concern is that because the legislation is being put in place quickly, that it doesn't have all of the thought. And therefore, there will be, unfortunately, those unintentional ambiguities, unintentional because they just didn't mean to put them there, but the loopholes will exist. I think there are fewer loopholes in current legislation that's well thought out. And that's when financial advisors spend days, years poring through legislation, trying to find those ever so small loopholes that might exist that they can then exploit, such as the ones that were revealed in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. So I'm quite hopeful that Canadians will rise and not exploit these loopholes. And I'm also confident that once we come through this pandemic, the new legislation that will be put in place will be as thoughtful as the previous legislation.
Thank you, Paul. If I can have a personal follow-up on that one. So thinking about trends, in terms of the length and complexity of legislation pieces that are coming out of Parliament, for example, are you observing a trend where the more recent pieces of legislation coming out, are they somewhat more complex in nature? Perhaps the legislators are aware of and cognizant of the loopholes that have been exploited in the past, such as Panama Paper and Paradise Paper. And if that's on the back of their heads, are they potentially putting a higher degree of effort, if you will, and making sure that there are very few loopholes and learning from the previous pieces of legislations that may have allowed for these loopholes? Are you seeing any trends of that nature?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm an ethicist, not a lawyer, so I don't pour through the legislation quite as thoroughly. But yes, certainly, the world is becoming more complex, and legislation has become more complex. And complexity also implies that there could be more opportunities for loopholes to exist, because the people writing the legislation just didn't think of all of these other contingencies. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Here's another one. What about the situation we're dealing with right now? Knowing that there are falsified CERB claimants knowingly or perhaps unknowingly. Even the government appears to be ambiguous about how it would deal with these claimants.
Yeah, certainly the government has said, and I think when the Prime Minister spoke about this right at the beginning, I think he even admitted that yes, there will be people who will try and game the system, and it will occur. But we can only put in so many constraints. I mean, the government can put in so many rules and regulations that almost no one gets the money, one extreme. The other extreme is that they are so loose that everybody gets the money, and they're trying to find the middle ground here. Now, we all know that the middle ground means that some people may be able to exploit the situation for their personal gain. And I think the government has taken the wise stance of saying, yes, it will happen. There will be people who game the system, but it's more important that more Canadians who actually need all of this assistance receive it and acknowledge that the people who game the system become basically a cost of doing business.
Thank you, Paul.
Unfortunately,
here's another question.
You're fading out every once in a while.
Oh, I've got another question that has come up. Could there ever be a legal way of writing in the need to follow the spirit of the law within the legislation to remove the potential for exploitation of loopholes? Paul?
What a great question. I love the English language. I love the power and the beauty of the English language. And I really, really wished there was a way of writing a rule in such a way that everyone would grasp its spirit. But, you know, I think back to my little example of the beach, you know, the rules on the beach. Mm-hmm. And one of them said no ball playing. Well, if it said no sports, would that kind of capture the spirit? Well, somebody might say, I'm not playing a sport, I'm just kicking a soccer ball around. And so once again, I think it comes back to personal integrity. I think we all know that the spirit of the current legislation that the government is rushing through is to help the disadvantaged in Canada, who've been disadvantaged who through no fault of their own, but as a result of the pandemic. I think we all know that the spirit of the beach rules is We don't want people playing balls and throwing frisbees around and disturbing families who are trying to relax on the beach. The spirit, I think, is often crystal clear. The problem is people realize that there is a personal or a financial advantage from my taking this very narrow letter of the law approach and exploiting it for my own personal gain. Yeah, I really wish we could write a law that really captured the spirit that everybody knew. Yeah.
And that would be nice, but I guess ideals are there. Here's another one. Isn't it problematic to ask tax practitioners, for instance, to anticipate the motivations of legislation as opposed to interpreting the letter of the law? Could this lead to misunderstandings?
Absolutely. There could be misunderstandings. Tax advisors are, their job is to help people fill out the tax returns. So take a simple example. RRSPs are sanctioned under the law to reduce your taxes. And your tax advisor, if your tax advisor is any good, is going to tell you, please contribute to your RRSP if you can, max out on it each year if you can, because that helps to minimize your taxes. This is legally sanctioned. The problem arises when we move beyond this, move away from deductions that are legally sanctioned into areas that are gray. They're gray because it's ambiguous as to whether this is allowed for tax purposes or not. So tax advisors will often say, well, you've got probably a better than 50% chance of it not being challenged by CRA. So now they shift this onto the taxpayer to make the decision as to whether or not to claim this amount. Now, in an ideal world, if the tax advisor knew that there was this ambiguity here, that maybe CRA would accept it, but maybe CRA won't, then maybe the obligation of the tax advisor is to report this to the government and say to the government, there's this ambiguity here. Please clarify it so that we don't have people abusing the system. Now, that's not what tax advisors do. They instead say, well, it's up to the government to write those laws, not the tax advisor. We simply interpret this and then leave it to our clients to make the decision as to whether or not to claim the amount. I'm hoping that the tax profession, that the accounting profession, of which I'm a member, rise to a higher standard and say, no, we should be looking here at the spirit rather than the letter. But I acknowledge that tension, yes.
Thank you, Paul. Here's another question that has come up. How should leaders proceed when faced with contrasting obligations? For instance, the obligation of the leaders of public corporations to maximize shareholder values and loopholes around creative accounting.
Right. I guess the question really becomes, do organizations have obligation to maximize shareholder value? Many people would say, no, that's not the way corporations are supposed to run. The purpose of a business is to provide goods and services that are required by society in an efficient and effective manner, operating within the law and ethical and social norms. Profitability is not the aim, it's the consequence of being efficient and effective. So for example, my employer, Brock University, is a not-for-profit, but it has properties in St. Catharines and Hamilton. It has tens of thousands of employees. It has $300 million worth of capital assets. It has an operating budget of around $250 million. It's a business. We're in the business of education, but Brock University is a business. If we were listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, we'd be a small cap. So the objective of business is not to be profitable, it is to provide goods and services efficiently and effectively. The more efficient and effective you are, the more profit you make. Profit is a consequence of being efficient and effective. So now, back to, well, yes, I might be more efficient and effective by exploiting loopholes because I could make additional money that way. But then it comes back to, right, but is that the purpose? The purpose is to provide goods and services efficiently and effectively, operating within the law and social standards of behavior. Most people, I think, when they view business in a jaundiced fashion, view business that way because they perceive business leaders as exploiting loopholes for personal gain or corporate gain, as opposed to adhering to the social norms and standards that we expect businesses to behave. I'm a business ethics professor. I'm wholeheartedly in favor of business. I am unashamedly in favor of business. I also expect that all of the business leaders that Brock University and Goodman School of Business is turning out will adhere to the highest possible social and ethical standards, and therefore they won't see a tension between exploiting a loophole and trying to make a few extra dollars for the corporation.
Thank you, Paul. Here's another question. It's a follow-up to the previous question. So how should leaders proceed when faced with contrasting obligations? And the context of when the leaders are ensuring the company follows the spirit of the tax laws in the countries they operate. So multi-jurisdictional organizations.
Yeah, this becomes a real issue about multi-jurisdictional tax laws because countries set their tax laws for a variety of reasons. And Bermuda, for example, has very low taxes. So now, can you cleverly move money from one jurisdiction to another in order to minimize your taxes? Well, when Google, for example, transferred money through a Dutch company, so Google, an American company, transfers billions of euros through a Dutch company to an Irish company located in Bermuda, you have to say, just a minute, is there really tension here, or are you gaming the system? Okay, you managed to discover that if you set up organizations in 4 different countries, you can very cleverly move this money around. Why are you doing it? Because you don't want to be taxed highly in the United States, so Google moves all of this around. Google was then brought up before congressional committees. The response was, we didn't break any laws. Of course they didn't break any laws, but they did break the social standard of acceptable business behavior. And this is where the tension arises, because society expects businesses to rise to a higher standard than to simply exploit these loopholes. And so, yes, there is that tension that exists. You can, if you're clever, if figure out how to game the system. But that's why we refer to it as gaming the system, because you know that's not the intention of these laws.
Thank you, Paul. Here's a question that's come up, and you may have, I think you've answered bits of it here. I'll put it to you so you can answer this as well. So what are your thoughts on why people exploit loopholes?
People normally exploit loopholes because it's to their personal gain. It's often just that simple.
Right.
And I can understand it. There are lots of students of mine, who are suffering financially right now. And they get on the government website and they look through the rules and they go, wow, look at this. You know, I might be able to get some extra money here. Well, students, for the most part, don't have a lot of money. And so they know they don't quite qualify, but I can get a few extra bucks here. And so, yes, personal interest. We have to admit that we all have self-interest here. We also have other interests. And occasionally our self-interest takes over from our interest in others. And yes, it's natural. That's why I think that we have to demonstrate that high level of personal integrity by not exploiting them. I mean, integrity, difficult word to define. C.S. Lewis, the author, theologian, he defined it, I think, as saying, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And we know what the right thing to do is. We know we shouldn't claim that money if we're not eligible to receive it. It's there for people who are suffering hardship. And you may say, well, yeah, I'm suffering a little bit of hardship here too. Well, yeah, we're all suffering a little bit of hardship, but it's for the people who were very much disadvantaged as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think we all know who this was intended for. I think we all know the spirit of the law here. And so now it just becomes a question of, are you willing to demonstrate personal integrity by not putting your personal interests ahead of the public interest?
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Very, very insightful. Well, that is all that we have time for today for Business Breeders with Goodman's Best. I want to thank Paul, and round of applause from those who are watching on their behalf. Thank you very much, Paul, for taking these questions and answering all of those that came through. So thank you very much indeed. Very insightful and informative. I do want to remind our viewing audience that the next session of our webinar series is happening next Wednesday at 11 to 11:45 again. And it is on the topic of managing through the unimaginable. And that is with Dr. Andrew Godez, professor and dean at Goodman School of Business. As I switch my screen so you can switch that to the other screen. So that is all that we have time for today. Thank you very much for all of you who were able to join us today, and for those who are watching the recorded version, which will be available on our website. We are also working with Dr. Paul Dunn on creating a certificate program around business ethics and ethics in general. So keep an eye out for offerings that are being provided through the Goodman Group at the Goodman School of Business. Until next time, have a wonderful week and stay safe.
Thank you.